Okay, Beseder, so welcome again back to Gilat Chaverim, to Shirin Sfas Emes on the Parsha. Just again, because today was the Levaya of one of Gedolei Yisrael, Rav Gershon Edelstein. Just to mention a word, I read about the beginnings of his life, he and his brother, and it's interesting how from such a tiny beginning, meaning he came from a great lineage, his grandfather learned in Behaaloscha, his father was a Rav, but under the communists, they were barely able to learn. They learned in hiding. He and his brother, there was a Chabad Chassid who was willing to risk his life to teach them over there. And when they came to Eretz Yisrael and ended up in Ramat HaSharon, their original learning, they learned with their father in an old chicken coop. They cleaned out the chicken coop and they sat together and they learned with him. He describes the learning on the train. He would always go to visit his Rebbe. He ended up moving to Kfar Chabad to thank him for that gift that he gave them, that he learned with them at that time when it was so dangerous. They used to do, like in the stories, of hiding out in the woods, and they used to keep a chessboard on the table, and in the lookout, and if they thought that somebody was coming to look right away, the storm disappeared and they were playing chess. That was their chess master who was there. So from that came a lot of Torah and a lot of influence. So that's kind of the theme we're speaking about here in the Sfas Emes. We're going to look at a couple of aspects of Parshas Behaaloscha. Again, I realize that the countries are out of sync now. Okay, that Behaaloscha here in Israel, not so over there, but Torah always and everywhere. So it tells us that the Kohen is supposed to light the menorah, right? Behaaloscha saneros. It's a very strange verb for lighting the menorah. To make the neros go up, right? El mul pnei menorah yiru shiva saneros. That all of the 7 candles are supposed to be focusing in one place. It's very tricky. Now there's a beautiful midrash about this idea of the lighting. The midrash says, Behaaloscha. This is what it means in the Pasuk in Tehillim, Gam choshech lo yachshich mimeka, v'layla kayom ya'ir kachashecha ka'ora. David HaMelech says, darkness doesn't make anything dark for you. Night lights up like day. Darkness is like light. V'lanu amar Behaaloscha. So, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you are the source of all light. All is light for you. You're telling us to light candles, right, in your Mishkan. Lema davar dome. What's the mashal for this? The parable. L'melech shaya lo ohev. A king had a friend. Amar lo hamelech. The king sent him a message. Teida she'etzlecha ani soid. Guess what? Next week I'm coming for dinner. Poor guy. Amar ela lech v'taken li. So go and get ready for me. Right, you imagine the sweat breaking out. Halach ha'avo v'hitkin mito shel hedyot. What did he have? He put together a couch, a mita shel hedyot, some kind of little folding chair or something. Menorah shel hedyot. He had his little oil lamp that he lit up. V'shulchan shel hedyot. He had this plain table.
I wrote in my summary that he had IKEA furniture.
Oh, that would be good. I remember when I was in yeshiva, we had a madrich who got married. And all the American guys in yeshiva wanted to get together to get him a present. We asked one of the Rebbitzins what to get. We got him a Magimix, a very fancy blender. When we brought it to his house, so he put it on his table, which was a couple of milk crates and an old door lying across it. That was a shulchan shel hedyot. Kivan sheba melech. Now the king's procession came up. Bo imo shamoshim. He had his servants. Sibavu mikanu mikam menorah shel zahav lefanov, and they were carrying in front of the king golden candelabras. Kivan shura ovas kol hakavod. So his friend there saw all of this beautiful stuff. He's bayish. He was ashamed. V'hit min kol ma she'iskin lo. He hid away all the IKEA. Right, he put it all away. Right, shakol hedyotos. It was all simple stuff. Amar la melech, the king says, he walks into an empty apartment. Lo amarti lecha she'etzlecha ani soid. Didn't I tell you I'm coming to dinner? Lama lo itkante li kelim. Why didn't you, or the klum, why didn't you get anything ready for me? Amar lo ovo. So his friend said, Ra'iti es kol hakoved hazeh shebo imcha v'nisbayashti. I saw all of these beautiful things that came with you, and I was ashamed. Vitmanti kol ma sheitkanti lecha. So I hid away everything that I got ready. Show you klei hadyotos. It was all for simple people. It wasn't royal. Amar lo hamelech chayecha she'ani poisel kol kelei shevesi. I disqualify all the kelim that I've brought. I don't want to use any of them. Ubishvil avoscha, because of your love, eini mishtamish ela bishvilcha. I'm only going to use those simple things that you prepared for me. So too, the nimshal HaKadosh Baruch Hu kula ora. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is all light. Shenemar nahora imei shara. Right? Daniel says that light is with HaKadosh Baruch Hu always. Hu amar li Yisrael eskinu li menorah v'neiros. He told me, you get from me a menorah and neiros. Why? Because he's coming. He told them, Vasili mikdash v'shachanti b'soch. I'm going to dwell with you. V'asisa menorah zov tohar. And then it says, Kivin she'asu bas shechina. When they did it, the Shechina came at the end in Parshas Pekudei and filled the Mishkan. V'lo yochel Moshe lova al moed. Moshe couldn't enter. Ki shachan olav ha'onon u'kvod Hashem molei es ha'onon. Right. So then, only when HaKadosh Baruch Hu called to him, he was able to come in. And it says, what did he tell him? Behaaloscha es haneros. Right. That this idea, this concept, is key to the Mishkan. It's key to anything that we do. Anything that we do seems tiny, seems ridiculous, seems imperfect, right? If this is, we can imagine for a king who's boss of Adam, right? People who follow the things that they prepared for the coronation of the king in England. If people go to such lengths to have things at such perfection and with such beautiful things, how can anything we do for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right, be fitting? This is the lesson of Behaaloscha Neros. But why is it taught particularly with the Neros? Why isn't it taught with the Shulchan? Right? We had all the furniture there from IKEA and the mashal, the table, the chairs. Right? So why not the Shulchan? Why not the Mizbeach? Why not anything? So the Sfas Emes explains like this. He explains the midrash. Pirush mitzido yizbarach ein choshech ba'olam. There's no darkness in the world. Right? From the Bechina of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's only night. HaKadosh Baruch Hu ha'alim ha'or ba'olam. The word olam, the root of the word olam means to hide. Ha'alim. He hid the light into the world, in the world, kedei sheyeh lanu b'melech habidos yizbarach. We're able to honor him by finding his light in the world and bringing it out. That's our tafkid. Limtso or hagonus ba'olam. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's light is true, is everywhere, but it's hidden and we have the ability to bring it out. Umitzad ze eino dome la'moshel. He says, so in certain ways, the moshel, and it's interesting that he'll say this sometime, a moshel, the parable in the midrash isn't always exact. He says, Ki gam oren shel tzadikim mimenu yizbarachu. Meaning there you had the person, the friend stuff, and you had the king stuff. But really, everything we have, when a tzaddik brings out the light in the world, that's Hashem's light. A beautiful picture of what our avodah is in life. Find Hashem's light in the world, because that light is there in every single situation. In the darkest situations that it seems, that light's always there. And therefore Rashi tells us this fascinating thing. One explanation he brings for Behaaloscha, that strange verb for lighting, not lahadlik, it says you should light ad shetehei shalheves ola me'eleha. Okay, it's a strange image. If you've tried messing around with oil candles on Hanukkah or things like that, sometimes it's a little hard to light them. You hold the lighter there, the shamash by it, you think you got it lit, but when you pull it away, the light goes out. It didn't really catch. Only when you're able to pull away the shamash and the candle is burning by itself, only then have you really lit it. The question is, did HaKadosh Baruch Hu really need to tell us that? Wouldn't we figure that out? Would Aaron think, okay, I held the shamash there next to it, and the flame was kind of going up. When I pulled away, it didn't really go. I guess I'm done. Right? He knew that you have to light it. So there are many explanations. Rav Moshe Feinstein, I saw, but many others bring it. Part of the tafkid of the Kohen is chinuch. Chinuch means, right, that you have to be able to light up your student until the student's flame goes up by itself. Okay, so that even when he's distant from the Rebbe, right, that flame will have taken hold there. But here, the Sfas Emes is doing something else. He says, Ki Hashem Yisbarach bara olama ba'or. Okay, the world was created with light. It starts, Yehi or. Rak sha'odnom tzarich lechaber kol advarim leyached osam b'shorsham. We need to plug each thing in the world into that light. Okay, it's an amazing thing. If we think about appliances that we have that give light, you're holding a lamp that can give lots of light, but your job is to plug it into the source, and then that light comes out. And then that's, so to speak, lighting by itself. Me alehem. He says, the guf hadloka eina ma'isa adam. We don't make the light. What we do is aliyos haneros v'akelim laha'or. We connect everything in our lives to the light. So in the footnotes here, they bring from the Sfas Emes' grandfather, Chidush Yarim. He says, now wait a second. Why do we use this expression about a candle that it's ola me'eleha? Right? Especially it says, ad shetei shalheves ola me'eleha. The flame goes up by itself. The flame never goes up by itself. When you light it, that flame is locked into the wick. Right? It can't burn, it can't exist without the wick. It can't separate from it. He says, but this is exactly it. It says the flame takes hold of the wick, and then, right, that is what causes the wick to become a source of light that continues and continues. Same thing with the neshama of a Jew. When the light takes hold of the Jewish neshama, so then you're able to light any chayfetz in the world. Any situation, any item, any interaction you have in the world, you are able to cause that to light. And he says, you've got to realize that light always blends together. You don't have, when you have a few lights in the room, that the lights stay separate. Light joins together. And therefore, right, the light is there and it's part of us. And he says, the light, right, by connecting, he says, and the more the fire connects to the wick, so then the more that flame is able to go and to grow. And let's remember also, he says, that the flame, the concept of Beis Yaakov Eish, Yaakov Avinu is like the fire, is like the source, but Beis Yosef Lahava. Yosef is the fire because Yosef is the one who goes out and brings that light to all of those circumstances. Al Yedei Zeh, he says, Sholit Koach Eish HaTorah Mirachok. The power of the fire of Torah is then able to have power even at great distances. Okay, so this is this image that we have of the lighting. In another aspect of the Parsha, we find so what we're finding here is something that we do in this world. It can be something very small that we do in this world, but it's connecting that small thing to a source of infinite light. And then that thing becomes a conduit for that light in the world. Therefore, there's nothing too small, right? Just as we spoke, actually, that was when I spoke in Shari Chesed there. Any piece of Torah, any aspect of Torah is a conduit to that light. If a Jew learns Torah to the extent that that piece takes hold of him, it can be a pasuk of Tilim. But if that connects and touches, then the light of Torah takes hold and comes out there. Okay, so it's all there. Another aspect of something that we do in this world that brings about a very big reaction above. And the Sfas Emes will connect it to. Later on in the Parsha, we find Am Yisrael complaining. They were tired of the mon. They wanted meat. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu says, I can't. Okay, I can't fulfill what they want. It's not a natural hunger that was there. Right? It was this very strange phrase, Hisavu ta'ava. They caused themselves to desire. Moshe Rabbeinu felt that this isn't something that, it's interesting, the Morva Shemesh says a fascinating thing. It says first that the people were misonanim. Misonanim, on one hand, is explained kind of as complaining, but it can also mean depression. Right? The onen, in mourning, the onen is the first and deepest stage of mourning, right, which is there. So misonanim, he said, meant they fell into depression, what they call in Hasidic Sfarim mara shchara. And he said an interesting symptom of depression sometime is trying to just escape into all sorts of pleasures and physical experiences. That's why they were so hungry. Vayom k'misonanim, they were depressed, and then hisavu tava, they wanted something. And Moshe Rabbeinu said, I can't cure this by giving them all the meat and all the fish in the world. This isn't going to cure it. And Moshe Rabbeinu himself said, he said, I can't cure it because, and what happens also, he says, then it becomes a cycle. The more the person gets addicted to these attempts in pleasure to try and get themselves to feel better, and it doesn't, so you just go for more. And you cycle, right? You get depressed, you eat a pint of ice cream. You're depressed, they ate a pint of ice cream, so you eat a bag of chips, right? You get depressed, it goes on and on. So Moshe Rabbeinu said, how could I do? And there, fascinatingly, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells them, Esfoli shivim ish. Gather together 70 people, these 70 Zakenim, who were the Shotrim, who actually took the lashes from Yisrael in Mitzrayim. Explains the more of a Shemesh, because you need somebody who understands the people and their weaknesses to be that bridge between Moshe Rabbeinu and the people. Right? He says, you see a tzaddik doing something, right? And a tzaddik's drinking a glass of wine, and it's elevating him, and it's doing all these wonderful things. But it could be for you, when you drink a bottle of wine, it brings you down, right? And causes all sorts of negative stuff. So you need somebody who understands. That's why Chazal said, you're not memane amani galatzibur. You don't make a leader of the community. And then ken yesh lo kupa shel shrotzim al gabov. He's got to have a past. He's got to have a box of vermin, literally, that's how they translate it, on his back. Because then he can be understanding. He can understand people. And he can share his process of getting out of it with them. But the Sfas Emes is focusing on the idea that it says gather them. Right? Why doesn't it say appoint them? It was an appointment. Why gather? So he brings a fascinating midrash. Midrash Rabbah on the pasuk from Amos. Habone b'shamayim ma'alosa v'agudosa l'eretz yisoda. It says HaKadosh Baruch Hu builds his lofty things above in the heavens, but his gathering, his group, is founded on the earth. Okay, what is this a mashal for? So the Medrash continues. Sorry, where they have the source. It says, L'ma davar doma. What is this like? Lepaltin shoysa benuya al gabe hasfinos. It's a fascinating thing. You can build a bridge over water, and the bridge is supported by like rafts or boats. Okay? Kozman shasfinos mechubaros. As long as the boats are attached and tied together, paltin shal gabein omdos, right? You build not just a bridge, a palace. You can build it on that, right? I think they do such things. You can build these big things on these big rafts. It says, Kacha bone b'shamayim ma'alosav. HaKadosh Baruch Hu builds all of these things in the shamayim. Kiviyochel kiso mevusas l'malo. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's throne is standing on what? Bizman sheYisrael osin aguda achas. When Am Yisrael are gathered together. The Kach nemar abone b'shamayim ma'alosav. When does HaKadosh Baruch Hu build his lofty throne? When agudosal eretz yisoda. That's also like the pasuk. Vayhi bishurun melech b'his asif rosh hayom yachad shiftei Yisrael. When is HaKadosh Baruch Hu king? At that time. So therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe Rabbeinu here specifically gather these zakenim. Esfali. Lama shekinuson shel tzadikim hanoya lahem v'hanoya laolam. The gathering together of tzadikim is so important. It's good for them and it's good for the world. The gathering of Rishoyim is the opposite. It's bad for them, multiplies their rishus, and bad for the world. So the Sfas Emes now explains the power of this esfa. He says, esfa li, right? Gather to me. Hashem said, again, what does this mean? Gather to me or for me. These were supposed to help Moshe Rabbeinu in running the people. So he says, this is what's called the Knesiyah L'Shem Shamayim. When people get together, l'shem shamayim, and it can even be just two Jews. It says, "K'shemisasvin b'nei Yisrael lishmo yizbarach." When Am Yisrael get together, l'shem shamayim, ba'avur ki yodim ki abinyan b'shamayim tolui bohem. What should be behind their gathering is to know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's palace, so to speak, depends on them. Action and reaction. HaKadosh Baruch Hu hid his light in the world. It can only be seen when we interact with this world al pi Torah, and suddenly the Or HaGanuz, the hidden light, comes out from each thing that's there. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, his concept of his throne, of his palace, means his presence in the world, but it depends on something. It depends on our togetherness. He says that's why Knessia shi l'shem shamayim, right? An interesting thing. We don't always use the same words referring to Hashem, right? We'll sometimes talk about shamayim, the heavens. That's very specific. He says when Chazal said Knessia l'shem shamayim, that means realize not just, okay, we're gathering here for the sake of God and His Torah. Realize that your gathering is creating a reaction above that forms the throne of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. L'shem shamayim, not just for this worldly purposes when we gather together, but for that which is above. Again, this can explain how Hasidim treated so powerfully the idea of just getting together. The Tana Devei Eliyahu says, talking about the Pirkei Avos, says, "Aseh lecha rav uknei lecha chaver." Right? Make for yourself a rav, but knei, literally like purchase, acquire a friend. So the Sfas Emes says, because a friend can do more for you, right, than a rebbe sometime. And then the Tana Devei Eliyahu continues on. What do you do with this friend? One of the first things listed is le'echol imo, to eat with him. There's this secret. Chazal say there's great power to eating, that it joins hearts together. It's hard to understand, but it's real. I'll tell you the proof that it's real. There are millions and millions of dollars spent every year on business lunches, right? People get together and they're not really doing all their heavy negotiation and things like that when you meet the client and go out with them for lunch. And you swipe the company card afterwards, and oftentimes it's in very nice restaurants. Why? Somehow eating together does that and enables us to do it. So he says, when you have a Knessia l'shem shamayim, so then Chazal say, Sofa l'yiskayim, in the end, it will be established, meaning it awakens things in the higher worlds, meaning that's the Sof. Right, the famous mashal, the Nefesh HaChaim brings it down. It's brought in Hasidic Yisraelim also, the bell ringer's rope. Okay, he says in many towns in Europe, you would have a very tall tower, and on top of that tower was a bell. And the way you would ring that bell is there was a guy who was a bell ringer. He would give a schlep on this very long rope, and that pull travels up the rope, up the rope, up the rope until the bell rings, and then its sound can be heard throughout the city. He said that's what we do with our mitzvahs. You have to realize the sofo at the end of our mitzvah is its source up there. And we ring that bell and the sound goes out. Here he says, this is the idea. What we awaken by this is the sof which is there. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu connected things that are ruchnim. All the spiritual things in the world are moved by Maisa Tachtonim, by what we do here. There was once a chassid who showed his Rebbe a newfangled sukkah he got. He brought him over to his house. He said, Rebbe, look at this. And he turned the crank, and then a roof came and covered over the sukkah. He said, so if it rains on sukkahs, I crank this, and it covers it over, stays dry. When the rain stops, crank, 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 and the roof opens up. And the Rebbe said, I like that, because that's what we're all about. We crank down here, and we move things up there. That's what it means to be a Jew. He says, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu connected all those things. So now here he says something which is very encouraging for us. He says, V'lo od, not just this, Elakol masha yordin yoser begolus. The deeper we fall into golus, right? We might think that as time goes on and our golus gets deeper, so our ability to affect things above kind of dissipates. We're too far away. We can't do such. He says the opposite. Ma'orei noid yoser. The deeper and further we are, the more our actions awaken things above and affect things above. He says that's why it told us that the Zakenim who were chosen were the ones who were beaten because of Bnei Yisrael. He says, it tells us that Zochu atel atakin mashagam Moshe Rabbeinu olav Hashem amar lo uchal. He says, Moshe Rabbeinu said, I can't do this. I can't handle this. The people are in depression. The people want meat. I can't do it. These people whose beginnings, who achieved their level in Golus, in the depths of the tomb of Mitzrayim, in the depths of the slavery of Mitzrayim, and what did they do? They gave their backs to protect the backs of Am Yisrael. So he says, they were able to do more than Moshe Rabbeinu, who's the Ish Elokim. Right? He says, how? By gathering together. By them gathering together. And those were people who learned togetherness in the most difficult times. So often when people are suffering and persecuted, your survival instinct kicks in. And it's every person for himself. So they who were able to overcome that in those times, they were able to accomplish more than Moshe Rabbeinu. So therefore, when Am Yisrael are in difficult times, when they're in dark times, so we shouldn't think, okay, in the old days, they were able to light a big light with their mitzvah. Now we can only do a tiny spark. In those days, when they would do something, a gathering down here, then the tikkun up in Shamayim would be huge. The opposite. The further we get, the darker we get, the more powerful our togetherness is, the more powerful our actions are, the more powerful all of these things that we do. He says, and you have to remember, Sha'apalterin toli b'kshiras hasfinos, that the palace of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is sitting on boats, and the boats have to be tied together. There's no one boat that supports that palace. So these connections here are really connecting the wires in the highest of places. Just finishing with the Sfas Emes says that the Torah is achdus, meaning the Torah is oneness itself. But in this world, branches separate, and we need to join them together. He said that is what will cause the roots above, right, to reveal themselves. When the branches down here are together and joined up to their source. And that's how and what we do. So the simple concepts that we have of togetherness, right, of two Jews sitting together, of eating together, the idea of doing something according to the guidance of the Torah, and to realize that with that you're unleashing the Or HaGanuz, which is in that aspect of the world. We have to remember how big we are and how powerful we are. I'll just share a beautiful image. There's a big Simchas Beis HaShoeva in Petach Tikva every year. There's a Rebbe there called the Rebbe of Mishkoltz. And I heard it's very big. Thousands of people come, and they actually broadcast it on the radio. And I heard a little bit of how he spoke beforehand. And he said the following. He said, Bnei Yisrael have promised that they're going to be kachol asher al Sfas Hayam. They're going to be like the sand on the beach, on the shore of the ocean. He said, why say, if you're going to talk about how many Jews there are going to be, why not say like the sand in the desert? A lot more sand in the desert than there is by the edge of the ocean. He said the difference is that the sand by the ocean is wet and it can stick together. The sand in the desert, every grain remains separate. You can't put it together. He says that's the blessing for Am Yisrael. That togetherness is key. Everything stands on it. So therefore, when a person does and has their mind and remember Chazal's image, or ner le'echad, ner le'mea, a candle that provides light for one person can provide light for 100 people, right? It's all that light which is there in the world, and we're meant to be, right, those people who light the menorah in what we do, who build HaKadosh Baruch Hu's palace through our togetherness, and to remember that the small things we do in this world have very, very big reactions above. Okay, have a wonderful week, wonderful Shabbos.